천인연구원으로 있는 공석이라고 합니다. 학술과 연구를 담당하고 있습니다. 오늘 전체 차이를 맡게 됐습니다. 오늘 우리 학술 부장이신 우리 이면한 선생님이 중간에 나가신다고 해서 제가 대신 인사드리고 있습니다. 여기까지만 제가 한국말로 하고 영어로 하겠습니다. Welcome everybody. This is the 12th Asia Forum. This is we are Asia Seminars, so we are all glad to have a great scholar today, Professor Stephen Castle. Actually, the Asia Forum, SNU Asia Forum is once a semester. We hold the Asia Forum, a broad academic approach to Asia and issue, facing the continent as a whole. So we have a lot of great scholars as a speaker so far. So most of our scholars present their very great vision or the challenging the methodology concerning the Asian studies. Today, we're so glad to have Stephen Castle, Professor, Sociology at the University of Sydney. So here we'll talk about its neoliberal globalization and social transformation, international migration issues, and Asia-Pacific perspective. Is title of today's topic. And also we have the many directors, Professor Hyun Jin Lim, and the council member, the professors of Hong Kyo Park, and many professors here, and great students, and so many audience here. So I expect it's a great the presentation and discussion today. And let me introduce Professor Stephen Castle. You have your shirt in the CV of the document, so I want to save time. There's a couple of things that I will point out. He's a research professor of sociology at the University of Sydney, and former research associate. He is a research associate of the International Migration Institute at the University of Oxford. Until August 2009, he was a professor of migration and refugee studies at the University of Oxford and director of the Migration Institute. He is a sociologist and political economist and worked on international migration dynamics and global governance in migration and development, and so on. So many things to give there. Actually, Professor Castle visited last year to attend our international conference held by Asia Center. We had a great time and very good discussion. At the time, he promised maybe he will visit again at the SNU and give us a good lecture. So today, we had promises that we're here. So. Today he's going to already mention the title, and this is a forum. There's a 16 minutes. He's going to present his topic, and 40 minutes we are current session. So please welcome him with a big hand.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Chung for this very nice introduction, and thank you very much to Professor Lim Hyun Chin for the invitation to speak here. And I'm aware that it's a great honor to speak in this leading center of Asian studies, so I am very happy to be here. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but it isn't working at the moment, but I'll start anyway. What I want to talk about today is really about the relationship between three things that we are studying a lot these days in Sydney. Neoliberal globalization, the process of social transformation in societies of all kinds, really, and international migration. And of course, international migration has now become an important issue for Korea and for other countries in the Asian region. I should have apologized for not speaking in Korean anyway. Let me do that now. Yeah, in the research we're doing, we're particularly interested in Korea because Korea has made such a very rapid transition from being an emigration country to an immigration country. But in fact, although Korea has a specific experience of migration, the issue affects the whole region, the whole of, especially of East and Southeast Asia. And indeed, it's a global issue, and we're trying to make some global comparisons. So what I want to do in this paper is to discuss how international migration is linked to broader processes of social transformation that arise through the neoliberal phase of globalization, which has been dominant since the 1970s. And on a more theoretical level, what I'm interested in doing is trying to link international migration research to general social theory, because very often migration is seen as something separate from the rest of the process of social change. And I want to show or to discuss that it's really very much a central part of this process. So this, what I will do in this paper is to discuss the theory of social transformation and to show how international migration is a part of it. And then I want to talk about some of the experiences of migration and social transformation in Asia since 1945, presenting an overview of Asian migration. And then I want to talk about some of the policy dilemmas faced by Asian countries at the moment in this phase of migration. And then finally I'll talk about some future perspectives for migration and ethnic relations in the region. All of this arises from a project we're doing called the Social Transformation and International Migration Project. And the key principle that we are pursuing in this project is that international migration is not a result of change or a cause of change, but very much part of the whole process, an integral part of the process of social transformation. So this project is based in the Department of Sociology of the University of Sydney. We are doing fieldwork in 4 countries: South Korea, Turkey, Mexico and Australia. And I'm sure you'll think these are very different countries, and that's really what interests us, the fact that they are different, but that they have 2 things in common. One is that they have changed very rapidly in the phase of neoliberal globalization, the last 30 years, say. And the other is that they have had very important experiences of international migration. We have 5 doctoral students working on this project. Kim Chulyo here is one of them, who is responsible for the Korean research. And we are collaborating with senior academics in all the countries, which is vital because, of course, someone from Australia cannot understand the cultural and historical factors that work in all these countries. So, for instance, in Korea, we are working very much with the Korean International Migration Association, which is a group of academics who work on these issues. And what we are trying to do is not to produce an individual study, but something done collectively by myself, the doctoral students, and our colleagues in the 4 research countries. So we hope we will produce some joint publications out of that. So I want first to talk a little about the theory of social transformation. I mean, anyone who studies society knows that society changes all the time, but we are interested in something that goes beyond this. There are certain periods when everything in society changes, all the different subsystems, the economy, the politics, the culture, even religion, are affected at the same time. And we call this a step change, when there is a really dramatic change that affects everything. And usually it's linked to a major change in either economics or technology or in political and strategic relationships, like the Cold War or the end of the Cold War, for instance. Here are some examples. For instance, the industrial revolutions that started in Britain in the 18th century and went through the whole of Western Europe in the 18th and 19th century were one such change where all other relationships, or nearly all other relationships, were changed too. A second one, and the one we're interested in at the moment, is the process of globalization since the 1970s, which has also led to major shifts in virtually everything else. And then I'm just postulating that maybe the rise of new powers, the end of the end of the bipolar world with the end of the Cold War, now the decline of US-American power could indicate that a new step change is on the way with the rise of the so-called BRICS powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So maybe there is another one coming, but I'm not going to speculate that. I'm talking about the second one of these. So we regard the key theoretical work on the process of transformation as Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, which was published originally in 1944, although there is also a 2001 edition. And Polanyi puts up a very powerful argument that the rise of market liberalism in the 18th and 19th century in Britain ignored the fact that the economy is actually embedded in social, political, religious, and moral relationships. In other words, the economy should be achieving social goals. It's not a purpose in itself. And Polanyi argues that that liberalism set out a system whereby the economy was seen as completely independent of the rest of society, and the only measure for its efficiency was whether it made profits or not. He goes on to argue that basing everything on profit in the end leads to the destruction of society, but also to the destruction of the economy itself. And he argues this because a system based only on profit will destroy labor power, because people will no longer be capable of working, because they will be working so much for such low wages that they become incapable of work, something that was happening in the 19th century in Britain. He argues that the environment will be destroyed because it will be exploited for profit without any consideration of long-term sustainability. And he argues that the economy itself will become incapable of working. And he goes on to argue that society protects itself through what he calls the double movement. So those are the two core concepts, really, of Polanyi's work. Embeddedness, the embeddedness of the economy in society, and the double movement, the protective movement of society against this very destructive form of economic relationships. And he gives a lot of examples to this. The rise of trade unionism in England, for instance, in the 19th century, the introduction of laws to protect child workers, women workers, limitations on the length of the working day, the legislation that became very important in the late 19th century in Britain, but also in Germany and in other countries. He also argues that some of the political movements at the time were part of this double movement against the profit system. And he mentions socialism, and he talks a great deal about fascism. And you have to remember this book was written in 1944, when he had seen the dangers that arose from this type of double movement. A double movement is not necessarily a progressive thing. It can be very reactionary and destructive as well. So Polanyi sees the economic crisis of the 1930s and the World War, the two world wars, as a result of this process of the economy becoming completely uncontrolled by the rest of society, and society trying to reassert itself. Quite a few theorists have taken up this notion, and you can find works, for instance, by Barawoy, Ronaldo Munk, Ulrike Schurkens, and other people taking up this notion and applying it to globalization. I first became aware of this through reading the work of Joe Stiglitz, the economist, who wrote a paper for UNCTAD. It was actually a presentation at the United Nations, United Nations Trade and Development Center. Yes. So he gave this presentation where he put this powerful argument that the reason that IMF policies were failing and the reason that World Bank policies were failing was that they didn't understand that economic policy also affected social relationships in poorer countries. And he pursued this. Stiglitz wrote an introduction to the 2001 edition of Polanyi's Great Transformation, where he makes exactly this link and argues that neoliberal globalization today is a new form of social transformation, and in a sense the same mistakes are being made. So you find the same disembeddedness, the idea that the only measurement of whether the economy is doing the right thing is profit, and that is now called, usually in the business press, shareholder value. If a company doesn't provide shareholder value, it isn't performing as it should. But there is no consideration of what it means for the workers employed by that company, the countries or the areas where it works, the effects on the environment. It's simply the value for the shareholders. The result of this disembeddedness is the increase in inequality. Neoliberalism originally claimed that because of its efficiency, there would be a move together of poorer countries and richer countries in terms of income. There would be less inequality. After 30 years of neoliberalism, we have very strong evidence that the opposite has happened, and there is more inequality between poor and rich countries, but also more inequality within each country. And I think Korea is no exception to that. Australia certainly isn't an exception. Another crucial effect, and that's perhaps what we're mainly interested in here, is that neoliberalism has led to an enormous transformation of many societies. And it takes different forms, of course. In the less developed countries, you see intensification of agriculture, rapid changes in the way people live on the land, people being displaced from the land, massive rural-urban migration, the formation of enormous cities with slum areas around them, and the erosion of welfare states, because the IMF prescription for structural adjustment is often to reduce educational expenditure, reduce health expenditure, reduce the welfare state. That's one reason, of course, why there are many skilled people available to migrate from less developed countries to more developed countries, because restructuring has destroyed the jobs they used to have. In the more developed countries, of course, especially in the older industrial countries, we saw a destruction of old types of industry. The so-called Rust Belt industries basically have closed down in the old industrial countries. The big companies have tended to invest in low-wage areas or in countries where labour rights are weaker, so that they can produce much more cheaply. We see the development of global commodity chains where one product can be made in many countries, different components. A computer can have one component made in China, one in the United States, another component made perhaps in Thailand, and it's all assembled in a fourth country. It's very efficient, but of course it means that the labour force loses an understanding of the whole process and loses the ability to affect it. So what we are studying in this project we're doing at Sydney is this process of social transformation. But one of the important things to realize about it is that although the global forces, especially the economic forces and to some extent the political forces, are the same everywhere, the effects are very different in different countries. So one of the methodological challenges we face is how can you understand this process of how global forces are changed as they move to the national and the local level. That's why we're having to do field work, do theoretical work more at the global level, and we're doing field work at the national and the local level. And we're trying to find not only similarities in these countries we're looking at, but also differences. So let me talk about how that might apply in East and Southeast Asia. And of course, it's quite impossible in the short time I have here to in any way adequately describe how globalization has worked in your region, and I'm sure all of you know more about it than I do anyway. Obviously, the Asia-Pacific region is enormous. It's very diverse culturally, socially, politically, economically. The Asia-Pacific region is the home of 60% of the world's population. So it's almost, well, it's impossible to make accurate generalizations. But I'm going to do so anyway. I think there have been two major changes in the region, and you can divide it up very, very roughly into two phases. You have the phase from the end of the Second World War until the mid-1970s, and to some extent you can even see the war itself as a force for globalization, because it destroyed many traditional relationships, forced many people to move, to change the way they lived and worked. After the Second World War, you have the process of decolonization in many parts, especially of Southeast Asia. So big changes in this process of political reordering, but of course at the same time the Cold War developed, so it was very much a contradictory development with many areas split in two. So you have the formation of new nation states, but in some cases, like Korea, like Vietnam, divided nation states. And in these divided nation states in particular, but in the region in general, you have the two great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, fighting for supremacy, but not moving to fight each other because it would be too dangerous, but carrying out proxy conflicts in the region. So I think that is what dominated this first period. I mean, there are many other things one could talk about, like Japan's economic reconstruction, but let me leave that aside for the moment. And then we have the phase from the mid-1970s where you get this geopolitical conflict declining, the end of the Vietnam War, stabilization in many states, and then of course the end of the Cold War itself, 1989-90, which seemed to be the phase in which the United States could build global dominance. I'm sure you all remember Francis Fukuyama's prediction of the end of history, which proved to be disastrously wrong. He's still a very popular intellectual in the United States. I can't imagine what So at the same time, you get this process of the shift in global investment strategies, the shift of investment away from the old industrial areas and to new areas, new industrializing areas, which at first, because they are low-wage areas, it's much cheaper for big corporations to produce in places like Malaysia, even Korea at that time, Taiwan, many of these places are seen as dependent industrialization, but then very quickly you get a modernization taking place and the emergence of new entrepreneurial classes in these countries and the development of a much more independent and competitive industry. At the same time, agriculture is being dramatically changed, and you have this process of rural-urban migration, which has been very important throughout the region. Demographic change in industrializing countries, fertility collapsed much more quickly than anyone predicted. Again, Korea is a very good example of that, with one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. And of course that brings social change with it, because if you have a system of welfare based on the family rather than on the state, you need quite big families. If the family declines in size, then there is a challenge to the whole system of how the elderly are looked after, how people with disabilities are looked after, and all the states of this region have to work through that change. There is also a process of democratization taking place. Dictatorships have fallen in many places. You get new constitutions, the rule of law, the emergence of trade unions, political parties on the Western model, and civil society organizations. And this goes hand in hand with cultural change. People travel more, they have experience of other countries, other ways of doing things, and of course communication through new media make it possible to have very widely based relationships. Finally, and again I think quite important here, is the increasing awareness of international human rights standards, which of course are partly mediated through the civil society organization, which make it much harder to exclude certain groups from society. And at the same time, of course, there has been a very large increase in migration within Asia and from Asia. I'll talk about the statistics in a minute. But I want to talk firstly about the model. We started studying this in Australia in the 1990s, and I was involved in an organization called the Asia Pacific Migration Research Network. And we tried to look at the issue of social and political change resulting from migration in Southeast and East Asian and later South Asian countries. And at that time, the dominant model, what governments said was, there will be no change. Migration is a peripheral phenomenon. There will be no social and cultural change. There was a strong belief in this part of the world, in Korea, Taiwan, Japan especially, in ethnic homogeneity, that it was important to keep one identity. In Southeast Asia it was a little bit different, because the post-colonial nations like Malaysia already had complex ethnic mixes, and there the interest was much more in maintaining existing balances rather than in achieving change. And the result of all that is that as countries industrialized and needed labor, both for economic and soon for demographic reasons, policymakers encouraged migration, but on certain conditions. It's important that there should be no family reunion or permanent settlement. It's generally thought by policymakers that international migrants should not be allowed to become citizens or even permanent residents. And it's a principle that the national culture should not be changed by the presence of people of diverse cultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. Next. I would argue that this model is becoming difficult to sustain. The process of settlement is beginning to take place. Employers or governments are allowing workers in temporarily, but the labour needs they meet are not temporary needs. They're long-term or even permanent needs, or even needs that will increase as there are shortages in the number of young people entering the labour market. A lot of Asian countries, and I understand that doesn't apply much to Korea as yet, are competing to attract highly skilled workers. And that too leads to concessions, to better arrangements for family reunion and for long-term stay. Singapore, for instance, and Hong Kong are experiencing that. The migrants, of course, don't want to leave often after a few years. They come with the intention of being here for a few years, but they build relationships. If they have children here, the children go to school. It becomes harder and harder for migrants to leave. So there is a strong pressure from them to stay. And what we experienced in Europe, and I think will happen in Asia too, is that as countries build stronger legal systems and embrace international human rights standards, it will become harder and harder to split up families and to deport workers who are not wanted permanently. So I think there will be big challenges to this Asian model of migration in the future. I just want to give you a little bit of background on the volume of migration, quite briefly because we don't have a lot of time. This is the situation around 2000, and you can see that at that time emigration was perhaps more important than immigration. So you can see the biggest emigration country in the region at that time was India with 9 million emigrants. Even Korea figures as an emigration country at that time, probably not much anymore. Some of these countries are still emigration countries today, like Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Pakistan. China is mixed, but a lot of the countries have now made the transition to immigration. Afghanistan is a special case, of course, because there's a mix of refugees and labour migration taking place. And this is where migrants were going from Asia around this period, around 2000. You can see even then, 43% of the movements, the biggest group were within Asia, labour migration within Asia from the less developed regions, countries like Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and so on. But they were moving to other Asian countries already, Japan, Malaysia, beginning to move to Korea, and so on. A lot of people were moving to the USA and Canada, others to the Middle East to work in the oil industries there. And you can see quite a mix there. This is much more up to date. These are the latest UN figures on world migration, and they go up to the year 2010. And what that shows, if I can get this point of work, LDCs means less developed countries, MDCs more developed countries. The big increase in migration from 1990 to 2000, if you look at it, is to more developed countries. More and more people are moving to the more developed countries. Of course, Korea is one of those. So there is really a very large volume of what you could loosely call south-north migration. Of course, there is enormous migration within the south as well. This is only international migration. If we were to look at internal migration, you would see that the migration within the south, within the less developed world, is much greater, although we have only very unreliable statistics on that. So you can see here the major regions, really the continents where migrants go to, and you can see that Europe comes first, but of course it's a much lower population base. Asia comes second, but as I said, Asia is 60% of the world. North America is pretty high. But let's look at the next one. if you look at the percentage of the population who are migrants, it's really very low still. For East Asia, it's almost invisible. It's 1 to 2%. Southeast Asia is a little bit higher. West Asia seems very high, but this is relative to a small population base, and this refers to migrant workers working in the oil, the Gulf oil states, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and so on. Central Asia is declining, and that's to do with the breakup of the Soviet Union, of course. Perhaps it's more interesting to look at the countries, and you can see that the USA is still by far the greatest immigration nation and is still having increased immigration. That was up to the economic crisis, of course, of 2008. It's not quite true anymore. China is tiny, very small international immigration. We're talking about immigration there. Korea is still very small. Malaysia, you can see, is increasing. So what we're seeing is the beginnings of migration to Asia. It's still very low compared with migration to the United States and to North America and Europe. But look at it in relation to population. That's more interesting. Australia still has by far the biggest migration in relation to population. About 24% of our population are immigrants, and about another 25% are children of immigrants. It's very close to half the Australian population have an immigration experience. Canada is very high, the United States is high. But Malaysia is interesting. Malaysia is really increasing quite dramatically. China is absolutely tiny, you can see. So there is, I mean, Asia still has very low migration compared with the rest of the world, but I think we're seeing the beginning of it. We're seeing a process that is going to take off in the next few years for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. And Asian migration has become much more complex. In the period, really from the 1950s onwards, there was a beginning of skilled migration to North America, to Australia, New Zealand, and to Europe, which often led to permanent settlement because the countries concerned were eager to have skilled migrants as permanent residents. We also saw from the 1970s onwards the temporary labour migration from countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia to the Gulf oil states. And of course, the beginnings of migration within East and Southeast Asia, a lot of that migration is undocumented or irregular. So for instance, in Malaysia, there are thought to be about 1 million irregular migrant workers. A new development in the last, say, 15 to 20 years is the increase in skilled migration. I put Korea there. I'm not sure if it's true about Korea because we were told yesterday that there is very little skilled migration to Korea. But certainly to some of the other countries in the region, it's becoming quite important, even to China. And one result of that is a global competition for skills. Australia has built its economy very much by importing skilled workers. It's becoming harder and harder to do that because Australia is finding it hard to compete with the very high salaries and conditions offered in some other countries. Educational migration, marriage migration. You know about marriage migration anyway. It's really a very special phenomenon which has affected Japan first, and then Taiwan and Korea, and has become really a very significant factor in Korea. When I first came to Korea, I think in 2007, I was very impressed by the fact that Korea had a multicultural policy. And I thought multiculturalism meant the same thing as it did in the United States and Australia and Britain. But it doesn't, of course, as you know. It means multicultural families, Korean husbands usually, and foreign wives. So marriage migration is a phenomenon of great importance here. Educational migration grew enormously over the last 20 to 30 years, but increasingly Asian countries have upgraded their education systems and now are also attracting educational migrants. And I think the old idea of many universities in North America and Australia that there was an unlimited reserve of foreign parents willing to pay for their children to study in an English-speaking country, I think that may be coming to an end in the next 10 years or so. And then, of course, there are still refugee flows from countries like Burma and Afghanistan. What is happening, what are the current trends in Asian migration? There is, in many countries, a youth bulge due to the fact that there was very high fertility until recently, and now that fertility is declining. And that means in many countries in Asia, there will be very large cohorts of young people entering the labour market over the next 10 years or so. And that will mean there will be very, very positive labour market conditions in some regions within Asia. But that is beginning to turn around, and especially the countries that are importing labour are already experiencing falling fertility and ageing populations. There's been a big discussion in Europe for many years about whether migration can make up for this decline in fertility. And there's a great fear, of course, of populations beginning to decline to the point where they become unsustainable. Italy is one country which is talking a great deal about that. Spain too. I think Korea is on the same track too, because the fertility rate in Korea is very similar to that in Spain and Italy. And that means that discussion on what is the appropriate way to manage it will have, well, I'm sure it's already taking place. You know, do you get people to work longer? Do you outsource work? What sort of work can be outsourced, because not all sorts can? Or do you bring in migrants? Or do you do a mix of all those things? Another important trend over the last 20 years has been the feminization of migration. I mean, women have always migrated. I mean, one shouldn't argue that women's migration is new, but you get more and more women now migrating to take up jobs, to enter the labour market, and that is partly linked to two factors. One is the development of what sometimes seen as typically female jobs, nurses, domestic work, clothing, electronics, and so on. But it's also due to the fact that by gender stereotyping, it's often possible to pay women workers less, or to employ them on a temporary basis, on a casual basis. So one can see that often the transition from male to female work is also an attack on the working conditions and the pay offered to workers. So it has two sides to it. Marriage migration, I've already mentioned, important in Korea and Taiwan. It may well become important for China and India in the near future, because, for instance, the Chinese one-child policy has led to a very strong demographic imbalance. There were many parts of China where there were about only 800 girls for every 1,000 boys, and that means that marriage migration, at the moment it's internal, but it could become an international phenomenon too. India too, there are big deficits in the number of women in relation to men. The question is whether this competition for skilled migrants will actually bring about a change in the way migrants are regarded. I think that has happened in some countries already, that because there is a strong desire to attract skilled migrants, they're offered permanent residence and family reunion. And that leads to a change in policy and in attitudes towards migrants in general. We've seen that happening in Australia and in the European Union. I think that will happen in Asia too. And then finally we see this development of diaspora policies. Many countries are trying to bring back their past emigrants who moved to the United States or other countries to gain high qualifications. There's a drive to bring them back either permanently or to get them to invest in their country of origin. So many countries in the region have set up special ministries or special agencies to try and embrace their diasporas. India is very interesting. India now has a Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. So what is going to happen to migration policies in the region? I think one of the big problems is that the changes that are taking place on the economic and demographic side are often not being properly understood by people who make policy. So the government code, the official migration categories sometimes don't correspond with social realities anymore. And when that happens, you get irregularity, you get policy breakdowns, and so on. We see often that people are changing from temporary to permanent status. In Australia, for instance, we have a great increase in temporary migration, but many of the people actually want to stay permanently, and it's possible to make that transition. But we also find people who are admitted on permanent permits decide to go after a few years. So the difference between the two forms of migration is getting eroded. We are seeing that people are thinking more and more in transnational terms. They feel belonging to two or even more societies at once because they have lived and worked in different places. They have accumulated entitlements. They have relationships in more than one society. Part of this is facilitated by technology, of course. It's become easier and easier to move between countries. Transport is cheaper. And of course, communication, electronic communication, makes it possible to maintain relationships even at a distance. The old idea that there were certain Asian countries that were emigration countries, countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh and so on, and others were immigration countries, is breaking down. Nearly all Asian countries have both in and outflows, and often transit migration as well. And of course, Korea is the great example for a country that used to have a labour surplus and saw a lot of emigration, and now is really very much an immigration country. And then, of course, some countries have been able to get around the brain drain of the past. Taiwan is a very good example. There are many Taiwanese left for the United States to get better education and jobs, and now they're coming back. And Taiwan has been very successful in maintaining the contact with its skilled emigrants. Yes. So I think this Asian model that that had the principle that migration would not change society, culture, is becoming unsustainable. But it has had quite negative effects. If you look at the migration policies of most countries, you find the lack of a long-term perspective. I mean, Korea, again, is a very good example of that. The setting up of the employment permit system with a very fixed duration just ignored the fact that the labour needs that it was supposed to meet are not temporary labour needs at all, but permanent ones. And it seems now that there is a great lack of agreement about what should happen to the EPS. Most governments are still denying the reality that long-term settlement is taking place and that societies are becoming more and more diverse. Malaysia is an interesting example for that. there were areas of Kuala Lumpur and other big cities in Malaysia where there were big areas of settlement of migrants, and it's simply not accepted by the government that this is happening. And every now and then they have a drive to expel people, and people are deported at very short notice, even though they can probably come back soon afterwards because they're still needed as workers. Governments are not prepared to face up to this reality, and I think that until they do, there will be big problems. I mean, but that's not a particularly Asian characteristic, by the way. Many European countries had exactly the same problem. Germany took over 20 years to realize officially that migration had become permanent, even though it was obvious from the late 1970s onwards. Because of this, migration management is not very effective in most Asian countries. The categories are not really based on reality. At the same time, there is an increasing economic dependence on migrants for the so-called 3D jobs. And employers, of course, want to keep workers. If a worker is doing well, the employer doesn't want to send them away when their permit ends. And I think employer pressure, as we discovered again in Europe, employer pressure is a main way in which migration policies will get changed. Again, let me give you an example from Malaysia. In Malaysia, every now and then, as I said, they round up migrant workers and deport them. That usually ends when the plantation owners send a delegation to the government and say, you know, if you send away the migrant workers, we will have to close down the plantations. And then the policies are very quickly changed. So employer pressure is very important. I've already mentioned the effect of the rules for the highly skilled. So I think the forces of change that are important in Asia are internationalization of the economy, which makes it much more open, not only to investment and trade, but also to movements of people. The feminization of migration, which encourages family formation and will be a big pressure for people to stay longer. The trends towards democracy and human rights, which make it much harder to deport people. And the growth of civil society organizations, which will help to make sure these rights are not forgotten. I think Asian governments need to move to understand the consequences of the process that's taking place. Obviously, migration has been taking place mainly for economic reasons, but now it's a time when it's impossible to ignore the long-term social, cultural, and possibly political consequences. On the other hand, as those statistics showed, immigrants are still a very small proportion of the population in many Asian countries. There are a few exceptions in Singapore and Malaysia. There are a very high proportion already, but in countries like Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the proportion is still small. And that, in a way, gives a breathing space. There's still a time to work towards better policies before situations get out of control. But I really think that it's important that politicians and academics begin to address these tendencies that are taking place and begin to plan for the long term. Because I think what we've really seen in many countries is very short-term approaches to migration regulation. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So now the floor is open. So does anybody have a question? Raise your hand and introduce yourself. Yes, I think. So, and I'm going to pass around the microphone. So.
I'm Choi. You may call me Choi later. I see your theory is kind of a grand theory, which means that it is very difficult to disprove it. Okay. So my impression is that you put everything that happening in a certain period into your theory package, but those all things are sometimes seemingly maybe irrelevant to each other or independent of each other. So not everyone agrees that all those, the issues, worldwide issues or phenomena are the part of your transformation, social transformation. So, and my second impression is that your theory is not tightly linked to your field research. So, which means that I just wonder whether your theory is really necessary to analyze the immigration issues in Asia. So it's those two things, the theory and then field research analysis. At this moment, it's like your presentation seemingly like irrelevant, and they are not tight linked to each other. Okay? So this is why I wonder why we really need the grand theory to analyze the Asian immigration issues. And then the final question is, the liberalism itself is prevalent in Asia as well as in Europe, right? But as you noted at the end, the migration, the population proportion of immigrants is much bigger in Europe, but not in Asia. Why? What accounts for this difference? So this implies that one of the implications is that your liberalism does not account for all migration, phenomena, the issues. There is something different behind this kind of difference across the countries. That's it.
Thank you. So you want to go back to the question?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Thank you for your very interesting and insightful lecture. I'm Jang-min Kim from Graduate School of Korean International Studies of Seoul National University. My question is, I was very interested to hear your opinion on the employer pressure, because I thought that it was in the interest of the employers as well to keep the status of migrant workers as temporary and short-term, so that their wages can be lower and remain low, and there's little need to provide social benefits. So yeah, that's my question.
Thank you for a great lecture today. My name is Daisuke Kato, and I'm an exchange student from Japan. So I want to listen regarding kind of Japanese immigration policy. And first, there are three questions. So first is in Japan, the resistance to immigration policy is I feel strong. So if you have any solution to overcome such resistance, please let me know. And the second question is, what kind of immigration policy is really good or suitable for the situation of East Asian countries, especially Japan? And the third question, final question is, if Japan take immigration policy, what kind of influence are created on the Japanese society, you think? This is three questions. Thank you.
This is Chan Poli. I'm an economist, not sociologist. You indicated there's several types of immigration. but to economists, you have two distinctive types. One is temporary labor migration, and the other is skilled migration. So I would like to know the quantitative weight of those two types of migration, because I think the motive of host country or host employer and guest workers for those two types of migration are very different, almost opposite. So I would like to know the quantitative share of those two types of migration thus far realized, materialized. And then how do you foresee the future development of those kind of those two types of migration? Without that, I think we cannot have a nice and good immigration policy. So you indicate the lack of immigration management by the governments of the Asian societies. You need to supply some information for the government.
Yeah, I mean, these are all very good and very difficult questions. The importance of grand theory, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Choi. We are interested really in how these global processes, and I mean, you really can see a process of a creation of a global labour market and the change in the production form from national production to global commodity chains, which has become very important in the last 30 years. And it works differently in different places, and that's really why we need two things. We need a grand theory, but we also need multi-level research. Let me be more concrete. I think if one says it abstractly, it's very difficult. Just let me give you some examples from the countries we're studying. Mexico, for instance. The phase where neoliberalism really transforms the economy in Mexico is through the North American Free Trade Area, which came in 1994. And what the 1994 agreement did was to open the markets of Canada, the United States, and Mexico for complete competition between these states. The result of that was that in Mexico, a lot of agriculture became unviable, because the producer prices for many commodities fell. And the result was that many farmers had to give up work, had to give up their land, really, and move to the United States as migrants. So that's one effect of the neoliberal process in Mexico. I was there recently to study these things, and I became convinced that one of the other major, I mean, there were other factors, but I won't go into detail, but one of the main effects of neoliberalism on Mexico is the drug cartels. It's not only legal industry, it's illegal industry. And the appalling war that is taking place at the moment, 95,000 people have been murdered in the last 5 years in Mexico through the drug war. And you have this very strange situation where the United States provides the market for the drugs. They all go through Mexico to the United States. The United States provides the weapons for both sides. It provides the weapons for the police and the army in Mexico, but also the weapons for the drug cartels. And the United States at the same time demands that Mexico should regulate or stop the flow of drugs. And it's very closely intertwined with the whole economic changes in the United States and with the process of labour migration. But I don't want to go into too much detail about it. In Australia, the process of neoliberalisation really goes back to the Labour government of the late 1980s and early 1990s that had a policy of complete opening up of markets. to global competition. And the result of that was that the Australian economy has changed completely from being an economy based on manufacturing and agriculture to now being an economy mainly based on the extraction of mineral resources, which are sold mainly to China and Japan. And we are now suffering in Australia from what our economist colleague will recognise as the Dutch disease, that the Australian currency has appreciated so much through the mining that it is destroying our manufacturing industry almost completely. It's just not worth making things in Australia anymore. Now, these are all consequences of neoliberalism. And what I won't talk about Turkey now. In Korea, obviously, the main sort of event in neoliberalization, if you like, was the IMF crisis of 1997-99, which led to the increase in foreign investment and the increase in foreign control over many Korean corporations. So you can see how this process of the freeing up of trade, which is one of the main elements of neoliberalism, has actually had enormous consequences for different economies and different societies. I mean, in Australia we have a transition in the way people work through the rise of the mining, which employs very few people, and the decline of manufacturing, and the rise of the service economy at the same time. In Mexico we have a decline of agriculture and an increase in emigration, but also an increase in criminality, which can be directly related to the 1994 treaty. And in Korea, I understand there's been a big transition from permanent employment relationships to short-term employment relationships, and in fact to unemployment, which were phenomena that were much rarer in Korea up to now. So, I mean, what we're seeing is that this process does affect everywhere, but in different ways. So, I'm not claiming that the form of transformation is the same everywhere. What is the same is that there is a transformation taking place, and that it is profoundly affecting society. So, I mean, that's our claim. So the theory is not tightly linked to field research. Well, it would take a very long time to discuss that, but I mean, we think that the theory is very much guiding what we're doing, but of course not too much, because we don't want to preempt our results. We don't want to decide in advance what we're going to find. Why are there different immigrant numbers in Europe and Asia? That was your third question. I think it's a difference in the phase in which it took place. The big increase in migration in Europe was in the past phase, the phase from 1945 to the 1970s, where the investment was mainly taking place in older industrial countries. And so you get a big increase in the number of immigrants being brought into most of those countries. The United States is very similar. Whereas Asian industrialization is taking place mainly in the phase of neoliberalism, where production is being outsourced from the old industrial countries. So there is a difference in phasing there. But it's quite clear that the emphasis is shifting from the old industrial countries to new regions. One of the effects of the global economic crisis of 2008 to the present is a decline in migration to many former immigration countries, while in new immigration regions or new economic regions, migration is actually increasing again. Then the question about employers preferring workers who are temporary and short-term, which is a very good and important point. I should have been clearer. I think what happens is that there are different interests of different types of industry. For instance, to take an example of the USA, the agricultural employers want irregular workers who have no rights because they can pay them very badly. But the more successful industries, manufacturing industries and service industries, actually prefer legal workers. And what one finds is that industries that see themselves as having long-term labour needs and long-term qualification needs of their labour, they want workers to either have skills, formal skills, or to learn skills on the job. They have a strong desire to retain workers. So there are different interests there. And you often see this played out in political terms, that there are different employer groups with different demands. Yeah, Japanese immigration policy, very interesting issue. Since probably the late 1980s, there has been a struggle in Japan between different parts of government and different interest groups about immigration policy. There have been groups within Japan that wanted to recruit migrant workers, that have seen a need both for industry and for the services, especially for the care sector. And there have been other groups that have been very worried about the consequences for society. And the result of that conflict is that a lot of migration has taken place in an irregular way, and therefore is not very well regulated. So I think it's very difficult. I mean, I know that in Japan, some of the cities where there are many migrants have formed an association to try and press for a better regulation, better management of migration. And parts of the national government, especially the Ministry of Justice, are strongly opposed to this. And obviously this is a political struggle. It's very hard for an outsider to say how that could be changed. What kind of policy would be best? Well, I think the best kind of policy for Japanese immigration is the same as for any other country, and that is, if there are labour needs, they should be met in a legal way. I don't think it's acceptable that there be systems whereby migrants are pushed into irregularity or illegality. It is always better to have a correct assessment of the needs of the labour market and to meet it in a legal way through agreements with other countries, through legal recruitment and so on. I think Korea has made a lot of progress on that, actually. But the move from the industrial training system to the employment permit system was a step forward, even though the employment permit system has big problems too. The effects on Japanese society, well, again, you probably know more about that than I do, but I think what we are seeing everywhere in the world is a breaking down of barriers, that even without movement of people, there would be much more cultural transmission, much more openness to other cultures, through new media, through communications, through visits, through tourism, through people going abroad to study and so on. I think we will have an opening up of societies. And I guess it depends on your point of view whether you see that as positive or not. I personally think it's something very positive. And migration is part of that process, inevitably. So, yeah, I think Japanese society will change if it becomes more open, then Korean society will change too. But, I guess you have to make a judgment whether that's positive or negative. Now, the issue, economists always like figures. Governments like figures too, but they're often not very accurate. For instance, Australia publishes figures on skilled migration, and if you believe the figures, you would believe that the overwhelming majority of migrants to Australia are skilled, until you discover that they include family members of skilled people in those statistics of skilled migrants. And they don't tell you that. Very few people realise it. So about half the people within the Australian skilled migration program are actually family members who may or may not enter the labour market and may or may not have skills. Another statistic of interest is published by the OECD, which found that they did a study from, I think it was from the year 2000 to 2005, and they found that in the different countries, I haven't got the exact figures, but something like 40 to 50% of migrants had tertiary education. But that doesn't mean they'll be employed as skilled migrants at all. I mean, many migrants move to a richer country because they hope to earn more, but they will not be employed at their skill level because that skill is not recognized by the professional associations or by the employers or whatever. So, I mean, unfortunately, what I'm trying to say is that the figures don't always tell the truth, and you need to analyze them very carefully. And I think what we are seeing happening in many countries is a polarization of the labour market. And let me just speak about Australia here, because I know the Australian case very well. The government is saying we have a very strong need for skilled migrants. People who are opposed to that policy say, why aren't we spending more on education so that we don't need to import the skills? And I think that's a very important perspective too. You know, that we are using skilled migration to make up for the deficits in our own education system. That's not a good policy. But the government also says we don't need low-skilled workers. And that's really not true. Because it's so, you know, as the number of young Australians falls because of demographic factors, the educational opportunities get better and better. The majority of young Australians now get a tertiary education. They're not going to empty garbage cans, do cleaning in hospital, jobs like that. And so there is actually a very big need for low-skilled workers. And I'm sure Korea is very similar. I mean, I understand that most young Koreans do tertiary. Who is going to do the 3D jobs in Korea if it's not immigrants? And those are not jobs that are going to go away. They are long-term jobs. I mean, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, governments were predicting there would be no low-skilled work left in highly developed countries. That prediction proved to be completely untrue, because although you can outsource manufacturing and even some white-collar jobs, you can't outsource the construction industry, you can't outsource your hospitals, your care homes, and especially if the population is aging, there are bigger and bigger needs for people with lower levels of skill who are willing to do this work. So, you know, I think it's a bipolar division of skills. And I mean, we can discuss statistics. I mean, I'm very interested in statistics, but they're not so simple.
How do you evaluate the current American immigration policy? America is a very, very different position with other countries, in the sense that they are the country is the target of all kind of immigrants, but they are people, not the government, but the people. Not the policymaker, but the people are rather reluctant to receive immigration. So how do you evaluate the American immigration policy vis-a-vis other countries' policy?
Yeah, so, just respond quickly. American immigration policy is complicated. On the one hand, there is a very strong support for skilled migration. And again, if you look at the number of professors in science, mathematics, technology in the United States who are themselves immigrants, it's extremely high. You know, you cannot imagine Silicon Valley without Indian and Chinese experts. I mean, they've been very important. And I don't think there's a lot of opposition to that. There is opposition to low-skilled migration. And the United States, unfortunately, has this system that low-skilled migration is often irregular migration. There is a political struggle going on. I mean, certain employers want to, especially agricultural employers, want to maintain that system, whereas many people in the United States are opposed to that type of immigration Not for moral reasons, because they don't like the illegality. They're opposed because they fear the competition of workers who are forced to work for low wages. And yeah, I think that's a real problem, and that's why you get these laws in places like Arizona and some of the other states that are very anti-immigrant. Just one sidelight on that is that migration from Mexico to the United States has almost stopped. I mean, that was an enormous flow of migration for the last 20 years, and it's almost stopped now. And it's stopped for two reasons. One is the very strong anti-immigration laws in states like Arizona, but the other reason is that the border is now so dangerous. It's so dangerous to cross that many people are just not even trying. And that has negative effects as well, because now the safety valve for Mexico of migration to the United States has been blocked. And the only job left for many young people is to become a soldier for a drug gang. So that's one reason the violence is escalating. So I don't know. I mean, it's not an easy answer.
We have 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes, so we have a lot of survey hands.
I usually don't ask questions to the person who presented so wonderfully written articles or works. I'm a political scientist, and when you talk about the social transformation, I'm very much interested in the political impact of that particular change. In the early 70s, 60s and 70s, we talked about the social mobilization, which implies some kind of social violence, the instability, those kind of things. And your grand theory, the transformation theory, certainly implies those counter movements, which resulted in communism, fascism, World War, that kind of things. When you're talking about the social mobilization and a social transformation, particularly you mentioned about an Asian Pacific perspective, are you foreseeing some kind of violent future in this region? And also another question is, I understand that you worked in Great Britain, Oxford University, working on similar studies. And we all know that Europe as a region is so integrated, and all this migration is not illegal anymore. And I understand that the national boundary, state boundaries now diminished or disappeared. So what do you see in Europe in comparison with the Asia Pacific region?
I'm Young-Hoon Song, a senior researcher at the of the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul-Daejeon University. In your presentation, you said refugee flows continue in Asia Pacific region, and then more than 50% of world refugees are residing in Asia, but China, Japan, Korea, South Korea, those countries are hosting only few percent of the Asian refugees. So my question is, how and to what extent do you think the neoliberal immigration policies have affected or will affect the refugee flow in the Asia Pacific region?
you very much for your wonderful presentation, and we really appreciate for your visiting to our university. My name is Jin Sam-jang. I'm a sociology professor here. I have two comments or questions. One is you time to time mentioned about human rights aspect, but I would say that migration studies should be more human rights based. As you repeatedly said, the migration occurred in the stream of globalization. There are major two movements in the globalization stream. One is the movement of money and product, and another stream is the movement of people, labor. But the irony is that there is a tendency to decrease the barrier of the movement of money or product. But still there are strong barriers of people's movement. So in this process there are huge violations of human rights. So in every aspect there is human rights issues in all aspects of migration. So I would like ask you to be more human rights based. The other one is you mentioned about feminization of migration, and the factor is that the release of middle class of women for labor, or the increase of female jobs, and also marriage migration. But when you say, when we say usually feminization, there is a danger to just mention about the size. So it is true, from my understanding, there is overall bigger size of female migration than male migration, but it's not same in every countries. For example, in Korea, still there are more men move in and out from the country for labor. But recently, marriage migration increased, even though. So, here again, I would like to emphasize that there are different experiences of men and women in the process of migration. For example, in female job, when you say female job, it's mostly domestic work, right? And in the domestic work, there is more danger of violation of human rights because it is behind the curtain, right? And also in marriage migration, there are huge violations, as you know, everybody knows in Korea. So I would suggest you to use gendered migration rather than feminization of migration.
Anyone? Okay, there are two more questions, and then.
Hello, my name is Mihan Lo, and I'm doing a master's program in the sociology department. And thank you very much for sharing your insights. And I have one question. It's about the policy that you mentioned. I really agree that we need to have more policies that can ensure that the migrants stay legal and work legal. But to bring about that change in policy, where do you think we can find that drive for change? Because for example, in Korea, the government, it's sometimes implicitly sustain the kicking out of migrants at certain times, and in Asian region it's hard to find, for example, any movements from the civil society to guarantee the rights of the immigrants. So in the Asian Pacific perspective, where do you think we can expect some hope for a drive for change?
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Jung Mi-kyun, research fellow at Asia Center. I like questions, a very quick question about the identity of my friend. What do you think determines the degree of assimilations, their assimilation to the mainstream culture of hosting countries? That is related to my research question. I just researched in Southeast Asia for a long time about the migration workers, so that I have a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone?
Okay. Okay, well, we would need a few hours to discuss these things as well. Yeah, I think, yes, Professor Hyde. The theory of the double movement is indeed a theory that worries one a lot because of this element, that Polanyi was arguing that fascism and communism really were consequences of, attempts to rebuild society, but of course in ways that turned out to be extremely negative. I don't see anything quite like that happening today because I think, that was a particular phase of ideological development and history doesn't repeat itself. I think what is likely to happen, I certainly wouldn't predict a violent future for Asia. I think many parts of Asia were very violent between 1945 and perhaps the 1980s, and in fact violence is declining in most places, fortunately. With exceptions like Afghanistan and even Burma is beginning to change. So the development is positive, but I think we are seeing a different kind of movement in many countries now that is rejecting the dominance of economic motives and profit motives as the only thing that's important in life. And I think we are seeing social movements, for instance, concerned with the environment, human rights movements of that kind. And I hope and think that will probably be the direction that this Polanyian double movement, if we like to use that, will take. That it will be much more movements for reform rather than revolutionary movements. So I don't think we are moving towards a more violent phase. There is another thing happening, of course, which relates to this third element I mentioned right at the beginning, the move of economic and political power from the old, dominant European and North American nations to what some people call the BRICS countries. That doesn't necessarily mean better human rights situations. If you look what's happening in China and India, it's often not the case at all. So the development is not inevitably a positive one at the moment. I think, ever since Fukuyama made this prediction, which proved wrong so quickly at the end of history, I think we should never predict that things will end. I think these struggles will go on for a very long time. I just hope that the struggles that move in the direction of democratization and stronger human rights. You asked specifically about what's happening in Europe. Europe is quite contradictory, and partly because of the economic crisis. On the one hand, you have the free movement within the European Union, but there is a lot of irregular movement from outside the European Union, especially to countries in southern Europe, Greece, Spain, Italy, and so on. So the migration situation is quite difficult. And we saw recently that politicians sometimes will abandon the commitments they've made for common policies if they feel threatened. For instance, France wanted to close the borders to people coming from Italy, migrants coming from Italy, who in theory had a right of free movement once they were admitted to Italy. But France was very worried that this was a result of the Arab Spring. So I don't know how strong the commitment will remain in Europe if the tensions we are experiencing at the moment continue. But migration policy is very problematic at the moment in many European countries. Hang on, I'm getting confused. Where am I? Yes, the human rights perspective as the basis for migration studies. It's quite difficult, actually. It's not as simple as it sounds, because human rights advocates, on the whole, advocate complete freedom of movement. And I find that difficult to, I can't really support that claim, you know, the idea of open borders. I think as long as there is such enormous inequality in the world, that there has to be some form of migration regulation. Now, if we could have a form of migration regulation that is based on the idea of labour rights and human rights, I think that's where we should have human rights. But I think the demand for complete freedom of movement is very difficult to achieve and could lead to very severe political conflicts, as we're seeing already, for instance, in the United States. I take aboard your remarks about gendered migration rather than feminization. I think that is a much better way of looking at it, and there is some very important work being done in many places on that. For me, I mean, a very interesting thing, I was trying to understand what had happened in Europe in the global economic crisis, and I discovered to my astonishment that migrant unemployment had increased, but so had migrant employment at the same time. So although there were more migrants without jobs, there were also more migrants overall. And it turned out that the reason for this was exactly this phenomenon of gendered migration, that it was easier to push migrant women into inferior working conditions and inferior pay just because of gender stereotype. So that would be a very interesting example for that process. And yeah, I think a lot of work needs to be done on that. Where can we find the drive for change? Well, I have always believed that if we can persuade policymakers and perhaps the public too to take a long-term view, then they will see that it is better to have a system based on legality and human rights than to have to keep changing and really not making much progress. I mean, I was working and studying in Germany for many years, and I was really amazed after the stopping of labour recruitment in 1973. And it became very obvious by the end of the 70s that permanent migration was taking place. And it literally took 20 years for the government to face up to that. So, you know, I think the public was well ahead of the government in that particular case, and sometimes one can see that. So I think our task is to persuade people that long-term solutions that recognise the rights of the people involved are much better than short-term solutions based on discrimination and exploitation. But, you know, that's a hope more than a prediction. The identity, what determines the assimilation of migrants? I mean, let me give the example of Australia. In Australia, we had an assimilation policy until about 1972. And the idea was that migrant workers should come in and they should take on Anglo-Australian values and be just like other Australians. And the policy failed. And it failed for a number of reasons, but the most important reason was that although migrants were meant to behave like other Australians, they weren't treated like other Australians. You know, they were, in fact, for some years in Australia, migrants were forced to take the worst jobs, and they were bound to those jobs. Because they had lower income, they moved to certain areas where housing was cheaper. So these areas became enclaves with many migrants. And then, you know, because migrants were living together, they were maintaining their languages and their religions and so on. So assimilation failed, and that's why Australia moved to a multicultural policy. And the policy in Australia was, and is now, to say that you have a right to have whatever religion you like, you have a right to speak whatever language you like, But you have to learn English if you want to succeed in the labour market, and you have to obey the laws of the country. You know, there is only one system of law. And that works for us. I mean, we find that we've done some research on which groups assimilate the most. And there's an interesting comparison at two ends of the spectrum. There are the Dutch and the Greeks. And have become indistinguishable from other Australians. In other words, they've assimilated within 1 to 2 generations. They don't speak Dutch anymore, they only speak English. You can't tell the difference in the way they work or anything. The Greeks, in the 4th generation, still marry other Greeks. They speak Greek at home. They keep the Greek culture and religion. But if you compare the economic success of these two groups, there's no difference at all. They're both extremely successful. They're seen as, you know, you find many Greek lawyers and doctors, and, you know, they've gone through a big process of educational mobility. So, you know, assimilation for us is no longer an issue. I mean, as long as people learn the language, join the labour market, and obey the law, what does it matter what they do in their culture? I mean, that's our attitude. And so, identity, I mean, to come back to your question, identity is very complex. I mean, why did the Dutch assimilate and the Greeks not? I mean, I can't give you an explanation for that. I mean, clearly, Greeks have a very strong national identity, which they've kept even over generations, and the Dutch seem to have a weaker national identity. But I couldn't explain why that is to you, I'm afraid. And I think if you look at migration in Southeast Asia, I mean, the example I know most about is Indonesians and Filipinos and Bangladeshis moving to Malaysia. And of course, there you have, in most cases, the Islamic identity is shared between Malaysia and Indonesia, and even the language is very similar. So the problems have been much smaller for the Indonesians than for other groups. But whether one can talk about assimilation, I'm not quite sure.
Thank you. I think it's time to close this 12th Asia Forum.
As you know, we live in the age of migration, as your book title. Nobody disagree, because we live in, I think it's 1.3 million migrants in Korea. So the number is rapidly increasing. So today's presentation, I think it's very appropriate for us to understand that this is a whole trend. And we are really wish is a great success in the comparative studies, research project on the 4 nation states. And we look forward to hearing or seeing the outstanding outcomes. And so thank you. So, thank you for all. So let's give him a big hand.